Hello everyone, my name is Tal and this is Due Diligence. As my loyal viewers, yes, all four of you, may have noticed, I've been ending my videos saying the world is complex, but it doesn't have to be complicated. The idea that I'm trying to convey is that by embracing the fact that things are generally not black and white, or even a specific shade of grey for that matter, we might find that they get simpler to understand. That by not trying to find the absolute one-dimensional sweeping answers and allowing for some nuance, we can often find answers that actually make a lot more sense and that are even easier to grasp counterintuitively. And that, yes, even this is not a black and white statement. When a point isn't supported by evidence or reason, taking it into consideration may actually make our understanding less nuanced and more cluttered. While I've mostly been using the God question to demonstrate this, and will probably continue to do that in the future, it does apply to pretty much all areas of life. One such area that is particularly close to my heart and my entire body and myself is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the perception of Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East versus the perception of it being an apartheid state. This, of course, is a very explosive topic, so I didn't feel comfortable touching it straight away. But now that my channel has grown to a whopping 20 subscribers, and thank you all by the way for joining, I finally feel that I can tackle something as divisive as this. Israeli human rights group B'Tselem released a report recently adopting a new stance toward the Israeli policy vis-à-vis the Arabs under Israel's control. As the title suggests, the bottom line of the report, or should I say the top line, is that this policy amounts to apartheid. So I think this gives us a great opportunity to take a look at this issue. A bit of background. The area under Israeli control can be roughly divided into two major categories. The first is the area that most of the world recognizes as Israel. That's the area that Israel had control over after the 1949 armistice. The world decided to recognize the armistice lines as Israel's borders. Generally speaking, people who were in this area when the armistice was signed were given full Israeli citizenship eventually. Theoretically, there's no difference between Arabs and Jews in this territory as far as formal rights are concerned, though few people will dispute that Arabs still face discrimination. Then, there are those areas that Israel gained control over during the 67 war. Here things get a little bit tricky. First among these areas is the Golan Heights, taken from Syria. While the international community mostly sees this area as occupied, Israel treats it as a full part of the country. Israeli law applies. Those who live there are full citizens with the same status as the rest of the country. Second is the Gaza Strip, taken from Egypt. Israel pulled out of the territory in 2005, removing all Israeli settlements and permanent military presence from the Strip. There's a local government, and Israel's control is mostly of borders and infrastructure. Israel does have significant influence over the daily lives of Gazans, but they can't be said to be under direct Israeli control. The issue of Gaza is quite complicated, and I decided not to overcomplicate this video by digging into it. I do realize that it means that the video won't present the full picture, but let's be honest, nothing ever will. Then there is the West Bank, taken from Jordan. This is where things get even more tricky. In the West Bank you have an interesting mix. There are the Israeli settlements, arguably illegal under international law. Some of them are fully legal under Israeli law. In most respects, these places are considered by the State of Israel to be part of the country itself. Jews live in them and enjoy full citizenship and restriction-free travel within Israel. And the law that governs them is the exact same law that governs Israelis in Tel Aviv. Then there are the areas where Palestinians reside. Without getting too specific here, the control of these areas is partially Palestinian and partially Israeli. The important bit for this discussion is that Israel does have a significant degree of control over the lives of Palestinians in these areas, much more than it does over the lives of Gazans. Those Palestinians are not Israeli citizens. They cannot vote in Israeli elections, let alone run in them. When you look at each of these categories separately, it's difficult to say that what's going on in the areas that Israel considers fully part of itself is apartheid. There is certainly racism, including systemic racism, but in a way that's still very far from what you can call apartheid. Looking at what's going on in the West Bank, where the entire Palestinian population is at least under partial control of a government that doesn't represent them, that is not accountable to them in any way, where the set of laws and courts for Jews are those of the Israeli justice system, but Palestinians are under Israeli martial law and are subject to Israeli military courts, it's difficult not to call that apartheid. It's easy to see how if you try to find an answer that avoids this complexity, you're making your life more complicated. Over the years, whenever someone would call Israel an apartheid state, along would come its advocates and point to the formal equality that Israel gives its non-Jewish citizens. They'd point to the fact that we have Arab members of parliament, ambassadors, even a Supreme Court justice. I mean, how can this be an apartheid state if everyone can vote? If you have to choose a simplistic catch-all definition for the country, apartheid state just doesn't fit the bill. If you want to answer the question, is everyone in Israel equal in the eyes of the law, or is it an apartheid state? You'll find yourself in a bit of a pickle if you try to argue for the second option. You'll find yourself faced with the objection that Israeli law treats all citizens the same regardless of ethnicity, religion, nationality, and whatnot. If you try to bring up how Palestinians in the West Bank can't even vote, you'll have to contend with the fact that the West Bank is not part of the country. That if you want to say that it's occupied territory that Israel has to give back at some point, you can't expect Israel to offer full citizenship or citizen rights to those who live there. You may have noticed that I used a few different terms when talking about the Arabic population of these areas. I call those who are full citizens Arabs, and those in the Gaza Strip Gazans. I only call those in the West Bank Palestinians. This is part of the Israeli mindset. If they are all distinct groups, in terms of identity and in terms of circumstances, then it only makes sense that their situations are different and that our handling of them is different. We shouldn't think about them as a collective. Each group is a thing on its own. Arabs have full rights, Gazans aren't under our control. Palestinians are under our control, but not forever, and they do have autonomy. It's not apartheid. We don't discriminate between citizens. Arabs get the same rights, Palestinians don't, but it's simply because they are not citizens. And then in the last few years, negotiations with the Palestinian side aren't really happening. Israeli leadership no longer talks of ending the conflict, but rather of managing it. There were already concrete plans for annexing parts of the West Bank, though those have been suspended or cancelled, depending who you ask. This differentiation between these groups starts to make less sense. At the end of the day, they are all controlled by the same government. And while it doesn't treat them all the same, they are broken into different groups, and those groups receive differential treatment. Maybe it's all part of one coherent policy. Maybe this government, my government, does have a long-term plan for its Palestinian subjects. That was the question that B'Tselem tried to answer. They asked themselves, if we look at this as parts of one big whole, as a single policy, does it shed more light on this issue? Does it change the way we understand those different constituent parts of the policy? And they felt that it does, and that if it is all one policy, that policy is one aimed at ensuring Jewish supremacy. They felt that when you see it from this perspective, it makes more sense to call the whole thing apartheid. Of course, this is just an opinion. It's not a concrete fact of the matter. It's okay to disagree, to debate, to discuss. Personally, I think that it does make some sense to look at it this way, but also that it doesn't. Again, trying to put it all under one umbrella leads to somewhat skewed conclusions. Trying to avoid the complexity makes this a bit more complicated than it has to be. But at the same time, there are some things about this situation that we can only ever really understand if we try to evaluate the big picture, if we look at its constituent parts in light of one another. Looking at each part of it separately may also obfuscate some of the complexity. We definitely gain some understanding by analyzing Israel's policies as a whole. But we also gain some understanding by analyzing those policies separately. Looking at the whole definitely changes the way we perceive each of its parts. But it doesn't mean that those parts are all just parts of that whole. They each have their own meanings, and they influence the meanings of one another, or something. Unlike many of the things that I touch upon in this channel, this really is complicated. It's not just complex, but not complicated. Even acknowledging the complexity doesn't make it not complicated. I still think, though, that trying to avoid the complexity of it does make this more complicated than it has to be. So is Israel a democracy or an apartheid state? Both, and most things in between. We can't really evaluate the way this country treats its Palestinian citizens without considering its policies toward non-citizen Arabs under its control. Nor can we really evaluate its treatment of non-citizen Arabs without considering its treatment of its non-Jewish citizens. This is complicated, but it doesn't have to be this complicated. Now, this channel isn't just about telling you to embrace complexity. It's also about spotting bullshit arguments and demagoguery, especially when they try to obfuscate complexity, because that helps the first part. If you're able to spot these points easily, it helps you declutter the complexity, right? It makes the complexity less complex. So here are a couple of examples, one from each side. Not because I'm a huge fan of balance for the sake of balance, but because, if we're honest, demagoguery is really not something unique to either side here.
We had a Supreme Court judge who's an Arab who sent my Jewish president to jail. That's not an apartheid. When you have the third biggest party in the parliament who's an Arab party, that's not an apartheid. When you have high-ranking officers, Arab Muslims, it's not an apartheid.
When you have the third biggest party in the parliament who's an Arab party, it's not an apartheid. The third biggest party in the parliament who's an Arab party.
The third largest party in the Israeli parliament is an Arab party. That's true. Yet, this is a lie. Israel has a non-Jewish Arab population of almost 2 million people. As you can imagine, their politics aren't exactly identical. And so the political parties that they established represented some of this variety. Over the years, we had a few Arab parties in our parliament. They were all small parties that were mostly ignored by the major ones, at least in practical terms. Of course, they'd been accused of being traitors, terrorists, and terrorist sympathizers, and they were the scapegoat du jour more often than one can count. But no one ever seriously saw them as legitimate parts of government. In 2013, a right-wing politician, Avigdor Lieberman, who had previously advocated very loudly for revoking citizenship from Arabs who don't pledge their allegiance to the country, and for the transfer of Arab citizens into the Palestinian territories, promoted a seemingly innocuous move of raising the bar for entry into the parliament from 2% to 3.25% of all eligible votes, under the pretense of increasing parliamentary stability. This number, funnily enough, was just north of what each of those Arab parties would traditionally get in elections, which would unfortunately mean that without some big change, those parties would probably not make it into the parliament in the next elections. This clearly wasn't at all what Lieberman had intended, right? No, I mean, he was just concerned about stability, sure. What he never saw coming, though, was the Arabs actually managing to put some of their differences aside. To make sure they get into parliament, they decided to unite and formed the Joint List, with wide representation of the Arab population's range of politics, and with members from all 4 Arab parties that were then part of the parliament. That way, they could pool all their votes to pass this new threshold. But that wasn't all. The attempt to silence the Arab voice also made more Arabs go out and vote. And so, while in the prior elections, those parties totaled 11 members of parliament, or members of Knesset, as we call them, in the elections after, they had increased their representation to 13. After those elections, many, including in the so-called Israeli left, were displeased with this increase, saying that it led to Arabs being overrepresented in our parliament. Now, our parliament, the Knesset, has 120 members. 13 MKs is just over 10%. Arabs constitute roughly 20% of the population. The very fact that people felt that 13 MKs was overrepresentation just goes to show that while we're not an apartheid, we're also pretty far from being firm believers in equal political rights for non-Jews. Officially, sure, we're a democracy, we believe in human rights and all that. Deep down inside, though, there's something misleading in the statement that the third largest party in our parliament is an Arab party. In truth, the third largest party in our parliament is the only Arab party. And even that is the case just because some in this country thought it was okay to try to take away an underrepresented, politically and socially marginalized minority's right to representation, so long as they're not doing it in a formal manner. You need to be extremely cynical to bring this up as an example of how not apartheid we are. And now to one of my favorite examples of bullshit propaganda. This time coming from the Palestinian side. I think this should be used in schools to teach what the equivocation fallacy is. These maps tell us about the Israeli ethnical cleansing of Palestinians. It shows us how Palestinians lost hold of their land. Just look at how this whole area used to be green, with no more than a few white dots here and there, and now the green is almost gone. All the land is now white. So sad. And let me tell you, these maps are actually pretty accurate. None of them includes any major falsehoods, yet when you put them together, the lie just jumps at you. In each of these maps, the green is Palestinian land and the white is Jewish or Israeli land. What changes though from map to map is the meaning of these terms. In the first map, the term Jewish land refers to areas where Jews lived and owned land, and Palestinian land is everything else. Empty desert, Palestinian. The beach, Palestinian. Rivers, forests, roads, mountains, valleys, all Palestinians. As are Palestinian villages and towns, of course. Then in the second map, what we see actually has nothing to do with where people live or with land ownership. It actually has nothing to do with anything real at all. This map tells us how the UN planned to divide the area into two states after the expiration of the British Mandate. Jewish land means the areas that will belong to the Jewish state. Palestinian land is the areas that will belong to the Arab state. There are Palestinians that live and own property in the so-called Jewish land, but those are still in white, just like everything else in the future Israeli territory. There are Jews that live and own property in the so-called Palestinian land, yet those are still in green in the exact same way. The third map is the aftermath of the war that was started over this division plan from the previous map. And just like the previous one, it doesn't have anything to do with where people are. But at least this time, it does have to do with some actual reality, rather than just a plan. Now Israeli land is everything under Israeli control. It doesn't matter if Palestinians live or own property in this area, it will still be presented as Israeli land. And the same is true, of course, for areas that no one lives in. Palestinian land is defined here, oddly enough, as areas under Egyptian and Jordanian occupation that were supposed to be parts of the planned Palestinian state. And then we get to the fourth map. Now the definitions are a mix of the third map and the exact opposite of the first one. Now, the Palestinian land is those areas that Palestinians live in, sort of like the areas that Jews lived in were Jewish land in the first map. And the rest, including all those places that people don't actually live in, is now Israeli. But it's even worse, because they threw the third map's definition into the mix. And now, not every place where Palestinians live is Palestinian land. Only those that are not within the internationally recognized borders of Israel. That is, the entire area that was Israeli in the previous map remains Israeli, but they added to that definition any area in which Palestinians do not live in what was defined as Palestinian land in the previous map. So now the definition of Palestinian land is reduced to only places where Palestinians live that are also outside of the area that Israel took over in 1949. If they included Arab towns and villages within Israel, they'd have to show a lot more green, and it just wouldn't look quite as tragic. Of course, just like the extreme dishonesty in the previous example doesn't tell us that Israel actually is an apartheid state, the extreme dishonesty here doesn't mean that Palestinians haven't lost land over the decades. They have, for sure. Some of it was even intentionally induced by Israeli policy. But it's just really nothing like what they try to present with these maps. Both of these examples are rooted in something real. The claims aren't complete lies. But the fact that those who make them resort to these distortions of reality really is quite telling, I think. Alright, I guess now would be a great time to stop. Your thoughts and comments are very welcome. Like, share, subscribe, all that. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, our world is complex, and sometimes it's even complicated. But trying to avoid the complexity will always only make it more complicated. Have a good one.